So our topic for today is on, well, aptly titled Consultants and Consultancy. I think it's important that we have a good grounding first on what these two concepts are. And if you're studying IT consulting now, then of course the IT portion is really more of a modifier or a qualifier to what consulting is to be expected. Of course, the IT portion is really more of a modifier or a qualifier to what consulting is to be expected. But at the root of it, or at the essence of it, an IT consultant would make use of the tools, the skills, and even the knowledge that any other consultant would be asked to exercise. So we'll start off with this session by having a good grounding on what's really consulting. What is this animal, so to speak? Is it something that would live on just a few resources, or is this some fad or some trend that may come in and out? Okay, like it's going to be very popular now, but maybe 10 years from now, 15 years from now, it's no longer relevant. So we'll take a look at what these concepts are, and hopefully these concepts will help provide the appropriate grounding for us to be able to tackle the other specific topics in this course on IT consulting. Now, first up, what is a consultant? Maybe that's the first thing that comes to mind. And for sure, you will have some ideas on what a consultant is. Okay. In the industry right now, there are many titles similar, and sometimes they can be used interchangeably with the word or term consultant. Okay. You can have a business advisor, a strategy consultant, an operational consultant, a leadership consultant. In some cases, you can have a contractor, a subject matter expert. Depending on the industry you find yourselves in, there are similar titles to the word or the term consultant. Okay, but as we are going through this course and we're trying to have a good grounding on what a consultant is, it would be good for us to perhaps start with a description rather than a definition. Okay. The problem with describing the role of a consultant is compounded by the fact that some existing definitions have been written by people who are not consultants and who do not understand fully what consultants do. Okay, to be fair, the profession known as the consulting profession, okay, that's not really well established. Unlike if you have an electrical engineer or a doctor or a lawyer, as a profession, it's pretty much well defined. In fact, it's so well defined that you even have legal regulations circumscribing what these professions are supposed to be doing. Okay. And then you have other professions that are more or less well defined, but they do not need government regulation. Okay. An example of which would be uh, perhaps in our case as IT consultants. Okay. I mean, it can be seen as the profession, or in the case, let's say, of a computer engineer. Okay. Yeah, it's an engineering type of profession, but it is not regulated by government. Okay, or an industrial engineer. Okay, it may not be regulated by government as far as professions go, but it has more or less a good boundary on what to expect, on what you would expect from an industrial engineer. And that's the thing. But with consultants, when we're trying to define or put some boundary on what the consulting profession is, uh, the thing there is that consultants are not created ex nihilo or out of nothing, right? In the same way as the field known as computer science, well, computer science didn't just pop up out of nowhere, or the field of IT didn't just pop out of nowhere. There was a preceding type of field that wasn't labeled as computer science or information technology. So when we're looking at the consulting profession, it didn't just come up and say, okay, here's the consulting profession, here's like the black box, everything you need to know about the consulting profession is there in that black box. No, I mean the consultant would have grown from a field or from a profession that wasn't really described as a consulting profession. So yeah, the existing definitions may have been written by people who are not consultants. That is true, but that's no fault of their own. I mean, it's something that okay, maybe they were doing something that we describe what a consultant would be doing nowadays, but they've been doing it for years already. Okay. And of course, there are some who don't really fully understand what consultants do because when you look at the consulting profession over the years, over the decades, the scope of work of a consultant is really varied. It's never constant or consistent across the years. Unlike if you have an engineering profession, for example, well, it's well defined, and you would expect that the engineering profession field would be consistent across the years. Maybe there will be improvements, but the variation is not big enough to create confusion on what the profession would be. But that's not the case with consulting. In consulting, perhaps you've been looking at consulting in a particular field maybe back in the 1950s or in the 1960s. But then if you move to the 1980s, the consultant would be focused on something else. Okay. So there's a wide range of variation as to the scope of work of what the consultants do, which is why it gives that impression that people don't fully understand what consultants do. Okay. But then for those who call themselves consultants, who've given themselves labels as consultants, I mean, the idea that you get from them on what a consultant is may, as it says here, can equally be misleading. Okay, so where do we get the basis now in defining what a consultant is? Well, we'll try our best to come up with the idea of what a consultant does. So we try to do some sort of a reverse engineering, okay, a reverse step, if you may, before we define what a consultant is. We try to find out what a consultant does. Okay. And hopefully, the activities of the consultant can give us a good grounding on what the consultant is. It's a bit weird because if you recall some of your philosophy courses, okay, uh, the essence of a being is what defines the operations of that particular being, right? But in this case, when we try to define the essence of the being, in this case, the consultant, we have to know first what it does before we can really have a good idea on what it is. Okay, but it may not be philosophically accurate or sound, but hopefully by going through this approach, we will have a better understanding of what a consultant is. So in this case, well, there are potentially 7 things that a consultant can do. Okay, they provide advice and recommendation to managers and may provide assistance with the implementation of those recommendations. Okay, well, from the root word itself, a consultant is somebody who is consulted. So definitely, if somebody consults you, what do you normally give in return? Well, you give them some advice, an opinion even. And when you give out an advice or an opinion, the person who's asked for it even has the option not to follow it, right? Anyway, they're just consulted. And somebody who's consulted, he or she may not even have a stake in what's being discussed. Okay, so there's that a particular nuance. So a consultant can be someone who's, you know, well, like a third party, like a second opinion, perhaps, if you're looking at it in the medical profession. And then, of course, if the advice and the recommendations given by the consultants are really, really good, very impressive, and they may even have the skill set to be able to follow through with those advice or recommendations, then they can actually be the ones to help in the implementation of the recommendations. It says here provide assistance, but it's also possible for consultants to be the ones who will lead the implementation themselves. I mean, that's quite possible. But at the root of it, the consultants generally they're the ones who are consulted. They're the ones who are asked for advice and they give advice. Okay. Now what else? Well, the consultant actually base their advice and recommendation on a set of skills and expertise or intellectual property they have available to them. So a consultant naturally will not just think out of thin air, right? The advice and the recommendations given won't be without any strong basis, right? And that's also going to be unfair to the person who's seeking advice, right? If somebody asks you for some advice and you're not perhaps the right person to be consulted because you don't have the experience or you don't have the knowledge or the skills involved, then you shouldn't be uh, authorized or obligated to give an advice to that question or to that request, okay? Because you don't have what it takes to give a sound advice or a sound set of recommendations. Okay, so definitely a consultant, before giving those advice and recommendations to the client, okay, typically they need to have that credibility beforehand. Okay, and somebody who is not credible, whatever advice he or she would give is practically pointless or useless. Okay. Now they also engage in dialogue with an organization and its staff and apply their expertise to develop recommendations, taking account of the specific needs and context of that organization. So definitely a consultant, depending on the depth of experience and knowledge of that person, can give advices immediately on the spot. Or it's possible that in order for the consultant to actually give appropriate advice and recommendation to the client, they'll probably need to do more things, similar to due diligence. So they do a little bit more research. Okay, they really go out, they really try to understand, ask questions. Okay, and they engage in dialogue, okay, with the organization involved. Okay, so it's possible that the one who's approaching you as a consultant, maybe that person is a leader of an organization. Okay? And the concern being raised is about the organization. So you really try to find out what that organization is. Okay, and part of the root word, which is consult. Okay, aside from the fact that you're the one being consulted, you also need to know how to consult. Okay, so that means that if you have an organization as your scope, okay, or as a big major stakeholder group, then you have to know how to deal with the people in that organization. You need to know how to ask questions, okay, where to look for the right answers. I mean, that's part of the skill set of any consultant, okay, and that's to be expected. And when they go out and they reach out to the organization and organizations involved, to the people involved, they know how to start a conversation with them. Okay, they're not going to be passive, sitting ducks, probably waiting for the people to give them information. Okay, no, the consultant is the one who takes the initiative, who reaches out to them, who really starts that conversation and keeps that conversation fluid and ongoing, okay, and even productive. And not only that, the consultant would have to know how to make it worth the while of the people that they're talking to. Okay? Remember, you're pulling them away perhaps from their own line of work or from the things that they really need to do at that particular moment. Okay, so it's also fair that you, in a way, compensate them for the time that you took away from them. And the compensation, need not be monetary in nature. It can even be something intangible, like if it's something that they learn from from the experience with you. Okay, that's good. If it's something that they can appreciate an immediate solution to a low hanging fruit, why not? Okay, so that's possible. But nevertheless, the consultant is the one who takes an active role in really trying to understand what the organization is. Okay? Knowing the lay of the land even before you give out the advice and the recommendation that's expected of you. Now, what about other things? What are the other things that the consultant will do where they're involved with a given client on a temporary basis? So the engagement is temporary. It's not forever. Okay, it's not until somebody gets tired. Well, of course, there are long-term engagements. That's possible, but even if it's short-term or long-term, the idea there is that that's always going to be temporary. It's not forever. It's not going to be obligatory to be forever. Okay. And being temporary, it has a start and an end. So a consultant must know how to start the engagement, and the consultant must know how to end the engagement. Later on, you'll find out that in a particular organization or particular client, you can have multiple engagements with that same client. So you start with an engagement, and before you're going to end the engagement, you start a new one. So that when the first or the prior engagement closes or ends, you now are able to start with another consulting engagement with them. Okay, let it go through. Okay, before that particular engagement closes, you come up with another possibility for that same client. Right? So you start again and then you end that particular engagement. Nevertheless, the idea here is that, okay, an engagement will always be temporary, and because it's temporary, it needs to have a start and an end, similar to a project. Consultants are independent. Definitely, they're not part of the company that they're doing their consulting work in. Uh, of course, unless they are part of a consulting company, in which case their client is the one that is the recipient of the consulting work that they do. Okay, but the idea of consultants is that they're independent. You don't want your consultants to be involved in things pertaining to your company or to your organization. And it works both ways. Okay, you don't want an outsider who probably does not have a full understanding or a full stake in the organization to be involved in important items in your company. Okay. At the same time, of course, as a consultant, you don't want to be embroiled in perhaps complications of the company, right? Maybe they're involved perhaps in some legal turmoil or dispute. Okay, I mean, being independent allows you to actually take an objective view of the situation and not be too involved or too invested, perhaps psychologically or emotionally in the organization. Okay. Now, consultants, they are not paid for from an organization's normal staff budgets because they're not employees, but they are paid. It doesn't mean that they are not paid at all. Okay, I mean, they are still paid. The structure of the payment is different from that of a typical employee. And there's that flexibility because they're independent, because they don't have you as their employer. Okay, the clients are not their strict direct employers. How they are paid is going to be different. Okay. And generally, of course, in the context of the Philippine settings, they will probably not get things that are mandated by law. Okay, like benefits, leaves. Consultants won't have that. Okay, and okay, there are pros and cons to that. Okay. But generally, the whole idea there is that their compensation structure is separate from everybody else as far as the organization goes. And lastly, they add value to a manager and the client organization by helping them to change. So ideally, a consultant is supposed to effect change, but they are not the direct proponents of that change. Remember, they're just consulted. So definitely, when they are consulted, then there is an objective in mind. Why are you being consulted? Well, if you're being consulted because the status quo may not be acceptable to the one seeking consultation, right? They want to look to change something. So definitely they'd like to change. So you as a consultant, your objective right now is to make sure that the advice, the recommendation that you give to your client is something that would enable them to go through that change without much difficulty. Or if there will be some difficulties, it won't be that many. Okay? It won't be a lot. But nevertheless, if you look at it, the reason why a client would reach out to a consultant is because they'd like to change something. Okay? They just don't know what it is. They just don't know how. They don't have an idea on how to proceed with it. They don't have a clear view of the future, perhaps, when they embark on such a change. Okay? And that is how a consultant would add value to that particular initiative. Now, so, in effect, When you have a consultant, what's the definition now? So we've taken a look at what a consultant does. Now we try to understand what a consultant is. It's a very long definition, but you can see more or less the seven elements on what the consultant does in this definition. Okay. So consultant is an independent advisor. So independent, we've seen that earlier that they work independently. It's an advisor, somebody who provides advices and recommendations. Who adds value? Okay. So by helping managers to identify and achieve beneficial change appropriate to their situation. So let's take a look at this for a bit. And if you try to unpack this sentence and refer it to the earlier set of slides, right? A couple of slides earlier, you'll notice that okay, a consultant is an advisor, an independent advisor. Okay? Uh, and being an independent advisor, they're not really integrated into the company, but they add value. They add value by helping the people in the company to actually effect those changes. Okay? And it is something temporary, so it is appropriate to their situation. Now, here are some of the terms that you will be encountering when you're doing consulting work. Okay? So I've mentioned briefly about clients, the client organizations. They're the ones who are paying the consultants to give them advice and recommendation. Okay, an engagement is some sort of an agreement or a contract that okay, as long as I am engaged to you, okay, I am bound by certain terms and conditions to provide you with those advices and recommendations that you expect from me, right? Stakeholders, well, obviously a client is a stakeholder, but the stakeholder group is not only limited to your clients or to the organization itself. Okay, it could be other people, it could be even your own company, your own consulting company. It can be the customers of your clients. It can be the vendors of your clients. There are many. Okay? Now, business development refers to, well, when you have an engagement already, like a client has an agreement or some contract already with a consultant. Prior to that, the consultant would need to find work, right? They need to find a lot of engagements. So what they normally do is that before an engagement is actually set up, they have to build that business. No? Think of it as selling. Uh, they need to sell their service. Okay. And another fancy term, perhaps, that is closely synonymous to selling is the idea of business development. You want to be able to build your business. Okay. Now, later on, you'll hear these terms also chargeable and billable. So, of course, there are certain things that when somebody asks you something, right? Let's say a friend, and you give an advice to that friend, well, you give it for free, right? You're not even charging that person or your friend a fee for the advice that you've given. However, there are certain outputs from the consultant that need to be charged. Okay. And normally, the output is a function of the level of expertise and experience that the consultant brings to the client. Okay. And these things, these are chargeable or billable items. Okay. Similar to what you would see perhaps in other professions, professional services like lawyers, accountants, they also have the concept of a chargeable or a billable item for the work that they do, for the service that they do. Okay. Now, another term that you'll probably encounter is the concept of opportunities. Now, you look at it both ways. It can be opportunities relative to the client or opportunities relative to you as a consultant. Okay? So, if you really want to build your business, then you look for opportunities. Okay? And those opportunities can now be converted into potential engagements. Okay? But sometimes an opportunity won't be ripe enough for an engagement, but there's still opportunities. Okay? Now, Proposal, normally before you start an engagement, you have a proposal. Contains your price, the scope of work that you intend to do. Okay? Once the client agrees to your proposal, and that's the time a contract is drawn up from the proposal. Now, there's another term, sell on or upsell. So essentially, based on the scope of work that you've done, which is the contained in your proposal, if you'd like to do something more that can be chargeable, then you do what is known as an upsell. Okay, you try to sell another engagement perhaps, or you're selling an extension of the scope of your original proposal, but then you add some amount to the price. Okay, so and you'd expect consultants to be involved in some upselling as well. Okay, especially if the core proposal, the very first proposal, is like your vanilla version that's so basic that it won't really help the client 100%. It can still help the client maybe around 50 or 60%. But if the client wants to go beyond the 60%, then that's also an opportunity for you to upsell. Okay? Or maybe, for example, if the client is not really interested to go 100% yet because of financial reasons, maybe they don't have money to pay you, then they should be okay with the original proposal, right? But if you've noticed that the client organization is right to actually absorb more consulting from you, then you can upsell. Okay. Now, service lines, as we've alluded to earlier, the consulting profession can be quite varied. So it can necessarily take on a lot of potential fields, potential areas. Okay. Defining what those areas are, you can call them service lines. So some consultants would only be focused, let's say, on infrastructure. Some consultants would only be focused on applications. Some consultants would only be focused on databases. Okay, some consultants would be only dedicated to user experience. Okay. So those are the different types of service lines that you would probably encounter. Now, certain consultants can be quite broad in their level of expertise. So these would be senior consultants or even strategic consultants. And most of them would have a lot of experience in the consulting business. So they perhaps started off as a very specific consultant and then they grew their skills over time to become a broader consultant. Intellectual property, intellectual capital, because you're a consultant, uh, you and your output is generally the advice and the recommendation. This is considered intellectual property. And it's possible that the advice or the recommendation you give to one client can also be repurposed for another client. Then you do have some material that can be subject for reuse, right? Which is easier for you because now you've already done this before in the past. So when you deal with the same advice and recommendation to other clients, you already know what to expect, right? So this gives you the opportunity to build intellectual property or intellectual capital. In fact, this is what makes the consultant really valuable. The idea of how much intellectual property a particular consultant would hold. So definitely consultants would be very smart people in the sense that because of their experience, because of their broad understanding of the market, of the environment, of the business, they're able to come up with newer advices for people. At the same time, those advices in the past that can be reused for other clients. Okay, I mean that really builds their credibility as a consultant. And lastly,
Sir,
the idea. Yes.
sir, my sincere apologies for interrupting, but may I ask a clarification lang po?
Yeah. Go ahead, please.
Sir, I would just like to ask, so what you've mentioned before is that the consultants will be much more valuable if they have intellectual property.
Yep.
Okay, thank you, sir.
All right. Yes, it's they'll be more valuable if they keep on building their intellectual capital, their intellectual property. And in fact, that's a good question in the sense that if you're starting in the consulting business, typically you don't have a lot of intellectual property right at the start. So normally consultants would join a consulting firm. So they work with other senior consultants, which would allow them to actually build their own intellectual property, their IP. And then, of course, uh, when consultants join a consulting firm, these junior consultants, they're not really coming in cold. Like they don't have zero knowledge, right? I mean, they need to be able to have something. They need to bring something to the table. Maybe they have experience being a very good worker, perhaps a very good engineer, a very good specialist, okay, a very good operational guy. But now they're moving to the space wherein they'll be giving advices and recommendation as opposed to be the ones actually doing the dirty work, so to speak. So consultants, yeah, they build the intellectual capital. They become more valuable as they keep on building the intellectual capital. But when they start, they're not really starting from scratch, even if the amount of intellectual capital would be lower than most of the senior ones you'd encounter in the field. Okay. Okay, moving on.
Noted,
We
sir.
talk.
Sir, just
We
one last
Yeah.
long po.
Sure. Go
My
ahead. Go ahead.
sincere
Go ahead.
apologies again. Just and before you said that the consultants are independent advisors where they aren't working on a certain company. Is it working in the company they work in or working with the company with the client they're talking to?
Okay, that's a good question because consultants can be engaged in various ways. Okay, we'll talk about that in a while on how consultants really operate. Okay, some of them can be like solo consultants, but some of them can actually be part of a consulting firm. So they actually are part of another company, and that company is actually like a consulting company that does consulting work for other companies. So, in that perspective, if you are an individual working inside the consulting company, your employer is the consulting company, but you're doing consulting work to your clients. Okay, so, and that's typically what you see in the industry right now. No, you have a lot of IT consulting companies. Okay? So definitely you'll work for that company. But then once you start working, you're actually dealing with other companies. Okay, wherein these other companies would actually reach out to these IT consulting companies for advice, for proposals, for recommendations on whatever business problems that they have in their own current environment. Okay, so does that answer your question? We'll talk about the differences in a while, but
Okay,
but I
sir.
hope
Thank
I'm
you.
able to at least I hope I've been able to give you a little bit of clarity regarding that. Okay, moving on about utilization. Okay, so definitely because your output is intellectual capital, so what's your cost or what's your production resources, right? Or resources of production. Well, it's really the time that you consume to actually build that intellectual capital. In this case, we normally call that utilization, right? And some utilization can be chargeable or billable. Of course, some utilization, you cannot really pass that cost to your client because that is utilization that is really specific to you and not of benefit to your clients. No? Like, for example, if you need to go on training, well, you can't pass that utilization as chargeable utilization, right? Although in some cases it could be, but that's something that you'll have to discuss with your client. Nevertheless, for a lot of the internal work that you do for yourself and not for the client, those are not chargeable or billable utilization items. Now, how does consulting differ from other roles? Okay, well, we have three references here or three possible roles. Well, an employee, and a manager, and a business leader. Well, if you are an employee, well, as we said earlier, a consultant is somebody who is independent, doesn't work for the client's company, in which case they're not employees. So that's pretty obvious at this stage. So they're not employees. Okay. They can be contracted by the client company to do work for them, but they're not employees. Okay. And the reason why they're not employees is because it's possible, and more often enough, as we said earlier, the engagement of the consultant to the client company is temporary. Okay. And the temporary basis for that engagement can be somewhere from just 1 month or just a few days versus to maybe 6 months or 12 months. Okay, some consultants would have long-term engagements, more than a year. Okay, but the agreement with the consultant is it's not a permanent type of engagement. Okay, which is what employees enjoy, right? After the Philippines, after you've reached your 6th month of continuous employment with an organization, you are actually given permanency. In which case, I mean, as long as you're doing really well and as the company is doing really well, then there is no obligation for the company to sever ties with you as an employee. In the case of the consultant, that's not possible. You don't have stability or permanent tenure. Okay. Now, what about a manager? Well, a manager typically is also an employee, right? But an employee with greater responsibility. So, in that sense, the manager is not really, or consultant is not really a manager. It's by the mere virtue that they're not employees. But more than that, a consultant's role is something of, giving perspective to the manager. Okay. And the manager has grave responsibility to make sure that the changes that need to be done actually get done. So the accountability of the change rests with the manager and not with the consultant. Remember, the consultant is just consultant, right? Is just going to give you some advice, give you a few recommendations here and there, may even help you execute some of the things. But at the end of the day, the one who is accountable for all of the changes that's needed to be done is the manager. And same thing goes with the business leader. Okay, I mean the business leader, in some cases, would own the company. Okay, of course, the consultant doesn't really own that company, but similar to the manager, the business leader is the one that has the accountability to make sure that whatever changes that's needed can actually be implemented. But aside from that, a business leader needs to provide some sort of a security blanket for the consultant. Like as we've said earlier, the consultant may need to reach out to certain people inside the organization so that, okay, when they start to implement some of the changes that need to be done, uh, they need to consult with certain people as well. And then the business leader would make sure that these obstacles are removed. They're taken away from the consultant so that the consultant can do uh, its due diligence very, very well. Now, what are the typical dimensions of consulting? Okay, in this case, well, one, you can have an internal consultant or an external consultant. Now, an internal consultant is like a fancy term for an employee who will do consulting work within the organization, right? Well, they're still like employees, but the difference is that some employees would be focused on operations. The internal consultant would probably be someone who will, try to think out of the box, be a subject matter expert, but wouldn't have the accountability to execute some of the things that needed to be done. Okay. And that's very typical in very large organizations. You can have internal consultants, okay? And they're just like other employees. Or you can have external consultants. So these are the normal configuration items or modes that we see. Okay, a consultant who is not an employee of the organization of the client, okay, being able to do consulting work. Now, a consultant can also be a strategic consultant, an operational consultant, an implementation consultant, or a specialist. So this refers to the scope of the consultant's purview. Okay, I mean, if I'm the consultant, how much should I be concerned about, right? Do I need to be concerned about the entire company, or do I need to be concerned about specific functions of the company, or do I need to just take a look at small items within the organization? Okay. So those are the dimensions of consulting. Okay. And they're all consultants. Okay. So even within the consulting profession, there, as we said earlier, there's a lot of variability. But we can somehow define the variability according to the client. Okay, so the client can be your own organization, or it can be another organization, or the scope of your expertise. It can be the entire company, or it can be just a specific function of the company, or even a specific process of a company. And here are varieties of consulting organizations. There are four ways you can work as a consultant, right? So we've somehow alluded to that a bit earlier. So you can work as a solo or independent consultant, working for yourself or for your own company. So you're the owner of your own company, you're a consultant, you're pretty much your own boss. That is like the so-called American dream, right? It's like, okay, you own your own business, you take care of everything. Okay, fine, that seems good. Okay, but then there's a lot of work that needs to be done. Okay, because as an independent consultant, it means that the business development would have to be done by you. The relationship building will also have to be done by you. Okay, so there are a lot of scaffoldings that you will not benefit from a company that does consulting, which is the second item here. As an employee of a major consulting company, so your company is the consultant, but you're just playing a part within that big consultant, right? In fact, the work that you might do is not really directly related to consulting, right? But you're still working as a consultant because of your involvement in a consulting company. Okay? Or you can be part of an organization offering a portfolio of services, of which consulting is only one. So this is not a pure play consulting company, but it can be like a conglomerate. And we see this in IT. Of course, in IT, there are so many fields. Okay, you can have uh, an IT company that sells product, but that same IT company can also sell additional services. Okay, and among the services that can be sold is actually consulting. So you can be part of that big organization, right? Has hardware, has software, okay, and then it also has consulting. So you can have that type of situation, or you can be part of a small consultancy company. Okay? Perhaps this is similar to what you see in law firms. So perhaps law firms, some of them are really small. I mean, they only have like a few partners. You can work in such a similar fashion. You can work as a consultant that way. If you think about it, other professional services are like consultants, right? Lawyers. They're like consultants. When you seek legal advice, they actually give you legal advice. They give you recommendation. They even help you execute some of these things. Lawyers can be considered as consultants, right? Or accountants, or auditing firms. They give you advice and recommendation on how you take care of your accounting documents, your books. They do auditing work for you. Okay, same idea. Okay, they can be considered as consultants. Okay, the thing here is that now you see the difference between an IT consultant and the other consultants, right? The IT consultant, definitely the scope is really about information technology. Okay? How does information technology help your client do their business better? Okay? And your job is to be able to give advice and recommendation to these clients in the field of IT. Okay? Now, why do you want to be a consultant? Now, this is a pretty provocative question, right? Because some of you might be thrown into a consulting profession by chance. Uh, some of you might not really like to be a consultant, but you find yourselves to be in a company that does consulting work. But for those who really are interested to become consultants, especially those who are advanced in their careers, okay, and I'm not talking about fresh graduates. The reason why they want to shift to a consulting profession is because they perhaps enjoy the process of consulting with clients. Maybe some of them are really skilled, very deep experience in the field, that they are typically the go-to guy, and they probably realize that they're a go-to guy. Okay, so they always provide advice, recommendations to other people. So maybe I can be a good consultant. That's the typical thought process. Okay. Now, the nice thing also about being a consultant is the potential variety of work. You're never straitjacketed into a very specific scope of work, which is typical in some organizations. You perhaps do the same thing in and out. Okay, there's no variety. It becomes dull and boring after a period of time. Well, in the consulting profession, it can really be varied. Okay, one time your client would ask you for X, the other time another client would ask you for Y, and then another client would ask you for Z. Exciting if you're the type of person who is always eager to learn new things, to tackle new things. Well, this is a great opportunity for you to be a consultant. Some people even join consulting for development of skills. They learn a new thing. Yeah, they learn a couple of things, and they become better professionals in the process. And other people would like to become a consultant because they're the types who don't want to become managers. So the typical route, okay, in your professional life is that, okay, you start perhaps at the rank and file, and then you move up to become a manager. But some of you guys would probably be more interested in doing very technical work. You don't want to manage other people. You don't want to be responsible for their performance, okay? And you don't want to have that burden if they're not really performing well, that you have to fire them or embark in some sort of a performance improvement plan. There are people like that, especially those who've been in the workforce for quite some time. They realize that they're not really cut out to be managers, but because they're very good people, they're very smart people, they have a depth of experience in a lot of the operational stuff, they can be consulting, and they can be relied upon as a consultant. That's the usual reason why they become consultants. And then, of course, I mean, this is true perhaps in the 90s, in the early 2000s, but consulting tends to come with it or bring with it uh, a lifestyle, okay, that is that can provoke envy really from a lot of people. Okay, because you're a consultant, you deal with multiple clients, and your clients, it's possible, can be based far away. So the opportunity for travel is there. And because consultants are sought after people, because of their knowledge, because of their intellectual capital, the clients would be willing to go out of the way to pamper these consultants. Okay, so the lifestyle can even lead to a certain level of extravagance. In fact, before the good old days, when I say the good old days because there was a time back in the US that IT companies, they were just splurging money. They're just splurging money. They go out on trips. They go on rest and recreation activities. And guess what? Because they're able to charge a huge sum of money from their clients, right? And these clients, perhaps they didn't know any better, as a form of a security blanket, they're willing to pay that much to the consultant. So it creates this excessive cycle, right, of extravagance and indulgence. Okay, and of course, people, especially fresh graduates, may be interested to go into consulting because of this. Okay? Nothing wrong with that. It's just that over the years, over the decades, uh, the industry, especially in IT, have somewhat consolidated in the sense that consultants are not living as lavishly as unlike before. Of course, there are still some clients who still want to pamper their consultants. That's fine, but that's already rare. I mean, and for you to be experiencing that, you really need to be a heck of a consultant to actually experience these things now, unlike before in the 90s. And yeah, some people who just want to enter consulting for the money. Okay, imagine that, no? You're doing certain things for your company, or you're an employee of that company, but you're not getting the appropriate amount of money in the process. So you just cut out the middleman. You just take away your employer. You might as well do that service for the clients directly. And yeah, that's an opportunity for big money too. Now, when you're doing consulting, so how do you charge? Right? We were talking about chargeability, we were talking availability. So how do you charge? Well, there are two factors that determine how much money you can generate as a consultant. Okay? The number of chargeable days a year you achieve and your daily charge out rate. Now, your daily rate is dependent on your level of experience. As fresh graduates, you're probably not going to get the highest rate. Okay. But as you build your skills, build your experience, your rates actually improve. They increase over time. The number of chargeable days a year, okay, it's really dependent on your lifestyle. Do you want to keep on working? Well, maybe your chargeable days would be close to more than 200 a year, right? But if you like a little bit of life, something a little bit more chill, perhaps you probably have fewer chargeable days. It's really up to you on how much you can really afford, right? So it's a combination of these both, now, right? Your charge out rate and the number of chargeable days a year. Naturally, if you're starting, if you're a fresh graduate, your chargeable days would be many and your rate will be very low. But as you grow up, as you move up in the ladder, okay, your rates also increase, but that also allows you to have fewer chargeable days, which gives you more time for rest, for recreation. Okay? So definitely the profit here is calculated by the days charge multiplied by your average charge out rate and subtracting the cost of business. So what is a good consultant? Now we know what a consultant does, what a consultant is. Let's raise the stakes, right? What makes a very good consultant? Well, a good consultant is somebody, well, based on the definition, continuously adds value to the clients, commensurate to his or her fees. Okay, it's possible that you will charge a client an excessive amount, and the client would determine that it's quite excessive. What will happen? You cannot do any more upsell with that client. After that engagement, that's it. You're no longer engaged to that client. Well, that's bad for you if you're still starting, because you definitely need a constant stream of money as a consultant. Okay? Now, there is a difference between being good at something and being a good consultant. Okay? So definitely being good at something is a good stepping stone to becoming a consultant. But that only gets you by the door. Going through that door and really staying in that place as a consultant, in other words, being a good consultant, takes something much more. Okay, being good at something is also known as table stakes. It's something that is expected of every consultant, whether good or bad. But if you want to be a good consultant, well, there's something more. And that's pretty much it. And don't that's something more, as we just ended our lecture for today regarding that, is what we will learn, okay, in the next few sessions. Okay, how to be a good consultant? Well, there are a lot of things that you also need to take note. Okay, with that, we end our lecture on consultants and consultancy. Do you have any questions?
Answer.
Mhm. So if there are no more questions, I will stop recording.